Thank you, Chairman Stile and Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee. Campaign finance is fundamentally different from most government regulation in the sense that it concerns the heart of democratic self-governance, when and how we discuss issues of public policy and public affairs and candidates for office. For that reason, the Supreme Court has noted that the First Amendment has its fullest and most urgent application precisely to the conduct of campaigns for political office, but I would add to that broader discussion, again, of public affairs and issues. The government should not constrain the right of the American people to discuss candidates and politics lightly. The Supreme Court has recognized only one permissible grounds for restricting speech, political speech, and that is the prevention of quid pro quo corruption or its appearance, and constantly rejected attempts to restrict campaign speech based on other legislative aims. The ASEC legislation should begin, as it does, by modernizing the disclosure regime and simplifying regulation. In the 2022 midterms, the average candidate for the U.S. Senate raised about $13.8 million. The average candidate for the U.S. House about $1.8 million. On top of this, you have about $7.4 billion spent by federal political action committees and another $1.1 billion by independent expenditures. In order to prevent people from improperly influencing candidates, contributions are limited to $3,300 per election. But any group of people that bands together to talk with the major purpose of defeating one or more federal candidates or electing one or more such candidates and spends more than $1,000 is required to register and file burdensome reports with the Federal Election Commission. Anyone spending money to independently try to elect or defeat a federal candidate has to file at just $250. Now, to the average citizen, even $250 seems like a pretty good chunk of change, let alone $5,000 that a group might contribute as a PAC. But in the context of a $1.8 million House campaign, it's hard to envision that this has any corrupting effect on the members of this committee or their colleagues in the House. And these numbers, we should note, have not been adjusted even for inflation since the 1970s, these numbers on disclosure, which includes donors of as little as $200. Now, free societies thrive on the public exchange of ideas. The First Amendment protects not only the brave, but it also protects the meek, the weak, and minorities of all kinds. For example, today we see people often publicly hounded for their association with groups, sometimes years in the past, that have for one reason or another become controversial. I'll just give one high-profile example, but I could give many others, including examples of people who we would view as much more ordinary citizens. But a high-profile example would be California's Proposition 8, which passed in 2008 in California, a very liberal state, representing over the votes of over 7 million people. Now, whether one agrees with the proposition or not, it was hardly outside of mainstream political discourse in 2008. Yet nearly 6 years later, Mozilla CEO and founder Brendan Eich was pressured into resigning from his company due to the controversy surrounding a small contribution of $1,000 he had previously made supporting Proposition 8, again, close to a decade before. If anything, our political culture is becoming more unforgiving in the decades since Mr. Eich's resignation. And faced with this minefield, many people will simply refrain from supporting political or policy groups rather than risk the backlash that may come years later. So these low reporting thresholds and excessive reporting requirements chill protected speech. Now, we should also note that disclosure of public debate has been sanctioned by the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court has never sanctioned disclosure of anything related to public affairs or political issue discussion. It has only sanctioned disclosure in the context of political committees, that is, organizations that exist for the primary purpose of electing or defeating candidates for office, or for speech which is expressly advocating the election or defeat of those candidates or its functional equivalent. And talk about dark money seems to hide this. We should note that so-called dark money consists of well under 5% of total spending in federal political races, and most of that dark money is, in fact, relatively well known to people. For example, large dark money groups identified as dark money groups, include the Natural Resources Defense Council, the National Association of Realtors, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I don't think that most Americans are scratching their heads desperately trying to figure out what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the National Resources Defense Council stands for. So in the end, I think ASIC makes good steps. One thing that I would emphasize here as I conclude is that it is important for ASIC to get out of the campaign finance regulation business. Other agencies, such as the Internal Revenue Service, which led to the Tea Party scandal, the SEC or the FCC, and leave this to the agency designated by statute to interpret campaign finance law, the FEC. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.